All right. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the lieutenants of George Washington. They weren't, of course, actual lieutenants in the Army. They were his right-hand men. They were the ones who really rallied around him, but particularly gave him advice. It's interesting, Washington as a leader of the Continental Armies, one of the ways that we contrasted the American Army with the British Army, was someone who always leaned heavily upon his council of war. He leaned heavily upon those officers who were junior to him, who were underneath him, but he wanted to know, what do you think about this plan? What do you think we should do? And he did the same as a president. In fact, when he became president, he had to invent the whole executive branch. I mean, sure, the Constitution outlines what a president can and cannot do. It outlines what his actual duties are and things like that. But it says nothing about having a cabinet, which of course is what every president, including Washington and since Washington, has had. This whole notion that you put people in these executive positions of power in order to provide you with assistance, in order to give you counsel. And so what Washington did was he chose very capable men. He chose men who were experts in their field, men who had very specific talents. As a result, these men were very diverse. They came from a wide variety of backgrounds. They all had different roles, different talents, different political viewpoints. But what they all had in common was that they were all loyal to Washington himself, even though they were often divided amongst each other. The first of these was his vice president, John Adams, who didn't actually directly choose Adams. That was chosen by the Electoral College. But what I want you to know about Adams was not really a great leader or speaker. And in fact, we'll take a look at that in detail in a later lesson. But Adams was really the thinker of the group. He was the intellectual. He was the man who knew how to write a very logical and sound argument. And because Adams was so good with the pen, but not really great at inspiring people publicly or with his speech, he was someone who was often underappreciated, and he often resented the fact that he never got the credit he felt that he deserved. To make matters worse, the vice president really only has two jobs. Number one, if there is a tie on a vote in the Senate, then the vice president gets to vote the tiebreaker. That doesn't happen very often. Second, the vice president has a very important job. He has to stay alive should the president die or somehow not be able to serve as president. And so Adams saw the vice presidency as a worthless position. He saw it as kind of a dead-end job, unless, of course, the president should die. No pun intended. But even so, Adams really despised his position. To make things even perhaps worse, Adams, who was short and rather fat, in fact his nickname when he wasn't listening was His Highness the Rotundity, was someone who was very formal, someone who was very cold, and tended to correct your grammar if you spoke incorrectly. He wasn't exactly Mr. Likeable. Now the second character we'll take a look at that was a member of Washington's cabinet, someone who Washington directly chose, was Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph served as the first Attorney General. So he was essentially in charge of the Justice Department. He was in charge of making certain that the laws of Congress and the sayings such as executive orders were actually enforced. He came from that great Randolph clan of Virginia, in fact was a relative to the great Peyton Randolph. And Edmund Randolph was a great man of the people. In fact, he was the one who came up with the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention, which said that whichever states have the greatest number of people, they're the states that have the greatest number of power. So he was a populist. He was someone who wanted to rule by whatever was most popular at the time. He was related to Thomas Jefferson, another cabinet member by marriage, which meant that they were family, but he was allied politically to Alexander Hamilton, another member of the cabinet. One thing to keep in mind about Hamilton and Jefferson, who Edmund Randolph had connections to both, was that they despised each other. I don't just mean like they avoided each other, I mean like wished each other would die kind of despisement. That's the key to understanding how this cabinet worked and functioned, but it's rather amazing how it worked. The third character we'll take a look at was Henry Knox, someone we've actually talked about before. If you remember, Henry Knox was that bookseller from Boston who was put in charge of the artillery of the Continental Army. He was the one who brought the guns from Ticonderoga over to Boston to lay siege to the British. Brilliant and very faithful aide to Washington throughout the entirety of the war. Knox was appointed the first Secretary of War, which meant, of course, that he was in charge of defense. It meant, of course, that if the nation should go to war, he was the one who would primarily oversee that war effort and would update Washington, who was commander-in-chief, as president. Knox was incredible. He was a man who had very little patience for what he called the silly plotters. In other words, those people of the cabinet who liked to manipulate each other or liked to have these intellectual debates, it just tended to irritate Knox. And so Knox, who was a man of action, was often known for losing his temper, turning purple, and then banging his hands and fist on the table so violently that he broke more than a few tables in the early cabinet days of Washington's administration. The next character is a man by the name of Samuel Osgood. Samuel Osgood was actually our very first postmaster, which meant that he was in charge of the mail service. Now, this is probably where you're starting to doze off a little bit and think, okay, great, we're going to talk about the mail service right now. But you need to think about Samuel Osgood a little bit. He came from Massachusetts, had been a military commander, had actually seen action at places like Lexington and Concord. But the thing about Osgood was a businessman. Osgood was somebody who was a brilliant administrator. He knew how to organize businesses. He knew how to make them function and make money, what we call profits. In fact, he would later become the president of a small organization, something known as Citibank, which is actually one of the world's largest banks to this day. But Osgood laid the foundations and actually ran the very first postal service, which meant you could have communication very quickly between the colonies. It's very hard to unite if you can't talk to each other. He also laid the foundations for the very first United States Mint, which actually allowed us to coin money. So Osgood was an integral part to the whole business. But again, he wasn't the intellectual. He didn't lose his temper like Knox. He was a man who was all about results and made certain those results came. Now, the last two characters we're going to talk about as members of the Cabinet of Washington are probably the two biggest characters, and we'll talk about them even more in the next lesson. But the first of those is Thomas Jefferson, who of course we'll even take a look at deeper when we take a look at his presidency. But Jefferson served as the very first Secretary of State, which meant he was essentially the first ambassador, the great diplomat, who represented the United States to all other nations. He himself was from Virginia. He came from the gentry class. He was a great statesman. He was also an intellectual. But unlike Adams, Jefferson knew how to give a brilliant speech, and he was a marvelous writer. In fact, he was the one who penned the Declaration of Independence. He was an ally of Patrick Henry. He was someone who very much supported France and was always suspicious of Britain, argued for things like a decentralized government. But above all, he and the other cabinet member, Alexander Hamilton, did not get along. In fact, there were entire periods of time where the two of them would not speak to each other. And when you're working as partners in essentially a business, as they were, it's very difficult to do your work if you're not talking to each other. In fact, they probably had to resort to things such as telling someone like Randolph or Knox, "Would you please tell Mr. Jefferson to say this?" or that I think this, because they wouldn't talk to each other directly. Hamilton himself, who we've also covered in past lessons, became the first Secretary of the Treasury. He had been that great aide to Washington, had been a very faithful and loyal soldier under Washington, shown his bravery several times, was someone who thought very differently about politics than Jefferson and thought that the real answer was not in farming or France, but in trade and industry and in Britain. All of these men were wildly different. But they were all chosen by Washington because of very distinctive gifts. And he understood that it would take all of their gifts to solve the challenges they were facing as a nation. How he managed that, we'll talk about in the next lesson.